Aubrey Weston was 42 years old, and he had learned something most men take a lifetime to forget. The quietest work is the work that holds everything else up. He had lived by that the way other men live by their credit score or their LinkedIn headline, not because someone taught him, because he had watched his father live it, and his father's hands had never once been empty. He was a structural engineer by trade, the kind whose name appears on the load calculations nobody reads until something fails. He had spent 18 years calculating exactly how much weight a thing could bear before it stopped being safe. He was good at it, extraordinarily good. What he had failed to calculate with any accuracy whatsoever was the weight his marriage had been placing on him for the last 4 years. He found that out on a Wednesday evening in late September, in the kitchen of the house he had paid for in full on West Haven Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had come home from a site inspection with red clay on his boots and a low headache behind his left eye that had been there since noon. He set his hard hat on the hook inside the garage door, the way he always did, and heard voices before he reached the kitchen. His wife's. And a man's. Claudia Weston Farrow was standing at the island in the kitchen, in a dress she had not worn for him in over a year. Her hair was down. She was laughing. The laugh she used when she wanted someone to feel like the most interesting person in the room. Beside her stood a man Aubrey recognized, Barrett Cole, 34. Director of brand partnerships at the marketing firm, where Claudia had made partner 2 years ago. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed by committee, and the self-assurance of someone who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. Nobody moved. Then Claudia turned, and the laugh didn't fully leave her face. It reconfigured, became something more careful. Aubrey. Her voice was light, the way someone's voice goes light when they are deciding in real time how much to explain. Barrett is helping me prep for the Meridian Group pitch. We're presenting Friday. Barrett offered his hand. Aubrey shook it. Claudia added, almost as an afterthought, "Could you eat in the study tonight? We're going to be at this a while." He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, then he nodded and went upstairs. He did not yell. He was not the kind of man who yelled. He was the kind of man who goes very still and thinks in straight lines. What he thought, sitting at his desk upstairs with an untouched sandwich and a glass of water gone warm, was this: she has been managing me out of my own house for longer than I noticed. And the fact that I did not notice is its own kind of answer. He was not wrong. Psychologists have a name for what Claudia had been doing, not consciously, not cruelly, not with any real premeditation, but doing nonetheless. It is called minimization by framing, the slow, repeated act of positioning someone as peripheral in their own story. Aubrey, could you handle dinner? Aubrey, the Hendersons don't need you to come, it's a work thing. Aubrey, Barrett just gets this industry in a way that's hard to explain. The words are never large, the damage is cumulative. He had absorbed all of it without complaint because he was a man who believed that love was demonstrated, not announced, and because he was, underneath everything, genuinely uninterested in performance. He did not need the room to see him. He needed to do the work. He needed to know the work was real. What Claudia had mistaken for passivity was depth. What she had labeled boring was bedrock. 3 weeks before the Meridian Group's annual leadership gala at the Westin Charlotte on College Street, Aubrey came home at 7 in the evening and overheard a phone call he was never meant to hear. Claudia in the bedroom, door half closed, her voice low and efficient, the voice she used for closing arguments. The thing is, Barrett. The house is in both names, but the equity is mostly his contribution. The financial advisor says, the cleanest split would be to list it before I file. If we time it right, after the gala, when the Meridian account closes, I'll have the bonus already deposited and we won't have to negotiate from a weak position. Aubrey stood in the hallway. He did not move. She kept talking. His pension is vested. That's the piece worth fighting for. Everything else is manageable. He walked back downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not from shock, more from the clarifying sensation of understanding something you had already half known. The thing that changes when it stops being a feeling and starts being a fact. He had been patient. He had been steady. He had been the kind of husband who came home. And what Claudia had heard in that steadiness was the sound of a man she had already decided she was done with. She had stopped seeing him years ago. She was only now getting around to the paperwork. He is not a man prone to self-pity. That would require spending time on the question of whether the loss was fair, and he had never found that a useful question. What he spent time on instead was simpler. What do you do next? What do you build from here? He had always been better at building than mourning. He spent the following week making several decisions, none of them dramatic, none of them announced. He called his attorney on a Tuesday morning, arranged a sit-down for the following Thursday. He asked his accountant to pull together a clean accounting of all capital contributions to jointly held assets over the course of the marriage. He made copies of every major financial document in the house and kept them in his truck. He also, on a Saturday afternoon, drove to the east side of Charlotte and spent 4 hours at a junior college career fair, talking to kids who were interested in construction trades. Not as a recruiter, just as a man who had something real to say. He bought lunch for 6 of them, left his personal number with 2 who looked like they'd actually call. He did these things quietly, the way he always did things, not because he was building toward anything in particular, but because the work itself was worth doing, and he had never needed an audience for the things that mattered most. What Claudia had not known, what she had never once thought to investigate in 4 years of marriage, was that Aubrey Weston was not simply a structural engineer drawing a salary. He had built something considerably larger than that, quietly, in the years before they met and throughout the years they were together. He had started a structural consulting firm, Weston Load Bearing Partners, out of his apartment 12 years ago with 2 clients and a laptop. He had grown it to 37 employees and a roster of municipal contracts across 3 states. The firm handled load analysis and safety certification for 12 of the largest construction projects currently underway in the Southeast. He had never talked about it much, not because he was hiding it, but because it was simply what he did, the same way a carpenter doesn't deliver a speech at dinner about every joint he fitted that day. Claudia knew the firm existed. She had been to the office once briefly for a holiday party. She had met his staff with the mildly distracted warmth of a woman who found other people's professional worlds difficult to care about unless they intersected with her own. She had no real understanding of what the firm was worth or what its contracts represented. She had no real understanding of a great many things about her husband. She had stopped looking. The Meridian Group's annual leadership gala was held on a Friday in mid-October. The Westin Charlotte, the kind of ballroom that makes you aware of your posture the moment you walk in. Crown molding, chandeliers engineered for exactly this kind of occasion. The room fills with people who have spent years learning how to look comfortable in rooms like this one. Some of them actually are. Claudia arrived at 7 with Barrett at her side. She wore a slate gray dress she had bought specifically for tonight and moved through the lobby with the practiced authority of a woman who has long since stopped being impressed by rooms. She worked every cluster of people she encountered. Priceless eye contact, measured compliments, the particular social fluency of someone who has studied how to be seen as indispensable. When a colleague asked after her husband, she smiled with calibrated warmth. Aubrey had a site visit run late. He might stop by. He's not really a gala person, honestly. Barrett touched the small of her back. She did not move away. Across the room, at a corner table near the stage, a man named Conrad Whitfield watched this. Conrad was 71, the founding chairman of the Meridian Group, a man who said little and noticed everything. He had built his business on the precise ability to distinguish between people who were real and people who were performing realness. He had been doing it for 40 years, and he was very rarely wrong. He had also, for the past 3 years, been Aubrey Weston's client. His firm had hired Weston load-bearing partners to certify the structural integrity of a new mixed-use development in South End. It had been the most exacting work Conrad had commissioned in a decade, and Aubrey had done it without drama, without delay, and with the particular thoroughness of a man who understood that his signature on a document meant something. Conrad respected very few people the way he respected that. He had told Aubrey as much once at a job site. Aubrey had nodded, said thank you, and gone back to looking at the drawings. At 8:15, the program began. Awards, remarks, the usual cadence of these evenings. Claudia sat at the firm's table, half listening, running through her pitch notes in her mind. The Meridian account would close, the bonus would land, and by January she would be on the other side of all of this. What she had not planned on was Conrad Whitfield returning to the podium after the formal program. He adjusted the microphone. The room quieted the way rooms do for people who have never needed to raise their voice to be heard. Before we conclude the evening, he said, "I want to acknowledge something I have been intending to say publicly for some time. We spend a great deal of time in rooms like this one recognizing people who are visible, who lead from the front, who announce what they are building before they have finished building it." He paused. "Tonight I want to recognize someone who works the other way entirely." Claudia set down her wine glass. Something in the room had changed temperature. 3 years ago, he continued, this organization commissioned one of the most complex structural certifications in our development history. The firm I hired was run by a man I had never seen at a gala, never encountered at a networking event, never heard announce himself in any room. He was referred to me by 2 people whose judgment I trust absolutely, and his work, when I saw it, told me everything I needed to know. He paused. "Aubrey Weston, I'd like you to come up here." The silence was 3 full seconds. Then heads turned toward the back of the room, and there, moving through the parted crowd with the unhurried calm of a man who has nowhere in particular to rush, was a figure in a dark charcoal suit. No fanfare, no practiced entrance. Just a man walking to the front of a room because he was asked. Claudia's hand went still on the stem of her glass. Barrett leaned toward her. "Is that your don't?" she said. Aubrey reached the stage. He and Conrad shook hands with the grip of 2 men who have worked together long enough to trust each other's word. Aubrey stepped to the microphone. He looked out at the room, let the quiet hold for a moment. Not for effect. He simply was not in a hurry. "My name is Aubrey Weston. I run a structural engineering firm on the east side of Charlotte. We do load analysis, safety certification, the work that happens before the visible work begins and that nobody thinks about unless something goes wrong." A few knowing laughs, the kind that come from people who understood exactly what he meant. He looked briefly toward Claudia's table. Not with anger, not with theater, just looked. "I'm grateful to Conrad and to the Meridian Group for this recognition. I'll be honest, I'm more comfortable at a job site than I am at a podium. But there is something I want to say tonight about the value of quiet work. Work that doesn't photograph well. Work that holds things up from underneath, that nobody ever sees unless they go looking." He paused. "That work is the most important work there is. Because when it's done right, nobody ever has to know it was done at all." The applause began before he stepped back from the microphone. The genuine kind. Several people were on their feet before if I got consciously decided to stand. At her table, Claudia sat still while the room reorganized itself around the truth of who her husband was, and had been the entire time. Psychologists call it schema collapse, the moment when the internal model you have built of another person becomes so violently incompatible with the evidence in front of you that the mind cannot reconcile both at once. Claudia had built a careful mental model of Aubrey over 4 years, reliable, quiet, steady, uncomplicated, peripheral. In the space of 4 minutes at a podium, that model had been dismantled in a room full of people she needed to respect her. Barrett refilled his wine glass. His third in 45 minutes. Aubrey returned to a seat at Conrad's table. He did not look toward Claudia again. Somehow this was harder to sit with than if he had. There are moments in a room when the air changes. Not loudly, not with any obvious announcement. The conversations technically resumed. A waiter moved between tables with a dessert tray. Someone near the back was asking a question about the Q3 portfolio. But underneath all of that was a stillness that had not existed an hour before. Every person in that ballroom was privately processing the same evening from behind the surface of ordinary behavior. What came next, what Aubrey said when Conrad passed him the microphone again, and what it had to do with the name of a woman sitting near the side wall is what made several people in that room go very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with decorum. There was a woman seated near the far wall at an auxiliary table. Her name was Ruth. She was 64. She wore a good dress that was not new, and the expression of a woman who has spent a long time watching other people be the center of things. She was Claudia's mother. Ruth had raised Claudia alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greensboro. She had worked 31 years as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized trucking company, had never missed a school event, had eaten dinner standing at the counter more nights than she could count, so there was enough food on the table for her daughter. Claudia's drive, her precision, her relentless need to be seen as successful, all of it came from Ruth. Ruth had poured herself into her daughter like a foundation poured into ground, invisible once it's set, essential to everything built on top. What Claudia had not known was that 14 months ago, Ruth had been diagnosed with a significant cardiac condition requiring a procedure her insurance covered only partially. The gap was considerable. Ruth had mentioned it once, quietly, and Claudia had said she would look into it. She had been busy. She had not looked into it. She had not known that Aubrey had. He had asked Ruth directly, in a phone call Claudia was not part of, whether he could help. Ruth had resisted. He had not argued with her. He had simply arranged it through a private medical fund connected to the hospital's foundation, covering the procedure, the follow-up care, and the 6 weeks of cardiac rehabilitation that followed. He had not told Claudia. He had not told Ruth that he was the source. Ruth had found out only 4 months ago, by accident, when a hospital administrator used his name in a call she happened to take. She had called him the same evening. He had told her it was nothing. She had told him it was everything. He had changed the subject. Conrad returned to the podium at 9:45. He cleared his throat once. "There's one more thing I want to share tonight, with Aubrey's permission, and because I believe that some truths are worth saying out loud in a room where they can land where they're needed." He nodded toward the side wall. 14 months ago, a woman in this room was facing a serious medical situation. She was facing it quietly, without complaint, the way some people carry weight, without asking anyone to notice. A fund was arranged, anonymously, to cover the costs her insurance did not. The treatment was successful. The rehabilitation was completed. She is well. He paused. The fund was established by Aubrey Weston. The room did not erupt. It went still. The particular stillness of people who have just witnessed something they did not know they needed to see. Near the side wall, Ruth stood slowly. She moved through the room with the careful dignity of a woman who has spent a lifetime being underestimated and has made her peace with it. She walked to the stage. Aubrey came down the steps to meet her. She took both his hands first. Then she put her arms around him and held on. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low, but the microphone was still open. "Thank you for seeing her when I couldn't make her see herself." Aubrey held on without saying anything, which was the only correct response. Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, has written extensively about what he calls moral elevation, the specific emotional response humans experience when they witness genuine virtue that has been quiet, unperformed, and unrewarded. A warmth in the chest, a pressure in the throat, an involuntary impulse toward goodness. It is one of the most distinctly human things we are capable of feeling. Every person in that ballroom felt some version of it in that moment. At her table, Claudia was not composed. Both hands pressed against her face, shoulders moving, the mascara she had applied with such care now entirely beside the point. Beside her, Barrett Cole, with $2.8 million worth of fraudulent expense reimbursements about to be discovered in a forensic audit the firm's finance department had already quietly commissioned. Barrett, who had seen Claudia not as someone exceptional but as someone useful, had nothing to offer. He refilled his wineglass. His hand was not steady. Conrad's firm had not announced the audit publicly. They did not need to. Barrett had not known it was coming. He found out at 9:53 that evening when the firm's CFO touched his shoulder and said, quietly, "You'll need to come with me." He set his glass down and went. He did not return to the table. Consequences do not always arrive with drama. More often, they come the way weather changes in Charlotte in October. Gradually, a degree at a time, until you realize, without being able to say exactly when it happened, that the temperature is completely different from what it was. The weeks that followed were like that. Barrett Cole's termination was announced by internal memo the Monday after the gala. The forensic audit had uncovered a pattern of inflated vendor invoices run through accounts he controlled, amounting to just under $300,000 over 18 months. His attorney advised full cooperation. Barrett cooperated with the particular desperate thoroughness of a man who hopes transparency reduces a number that turned out to be much harder to reduce than he expected. By November, he was facing civil liability and had surrendered his company credit card and laptop in the lobby of a building he had spent 2 years treating as his personal stage. The performance, it turned out, was all there had ever been, nothing structural underneath. This is what researchers mean when they distinguish between performed competence and earned competence. Performed competence is assembled from external signals, the vocabulary, the appearance of access, the practiced ease. It registers well at cocktail parties. It photographs well at galas. But it has no load-bearing capacity. Remove the signals and the thing collapses, because there was never anything inside to hold its shape. Aubrey, who spent his professional life calculating the difference between what things looked like and what they could actually support, had recognized this in Barrett the first time they shook hands. He had said nothing. It was not his business to say. Claudia filed in November. Aubrey did not contest the house in the way she had expected. He had already arranged to move to a bungalow on Sharon Amity Road near Eastway, a neighborhood with old trees and neighbors who left casseroles on porches when someone was going through something. He brought his tools, his drafting table, his father's fishing chair. He left her the furniture she had chosen, the art she had selected, the chandelier she had insisted on for the dining room. He took what was his in the way a man who knows what matters moves through a house he is leaving, without ceremony, without score settling, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has already decided what comes next. His attorney was thorough. The accounting of his capital contributions to jointly held assets over the course of the marriage was extensive, documented, and considerably larger than Claudia's financial advisor had estimated. Her clean split, the position she had been planning to negotiate from, was not the position the numbers supported. She adjusted. Her attorney adjusted. The process was not pleasant for either of them, but it was honest, which was more than the preceding 4 years had managed to be. The Meridian Group extended Weston Load-Bearing Partners' contract in December. 2 additional municipal projects were added to the scope. Conrad Whitfield sent a handwritten note, which Aubrey kept on his drafting table. He was not sentimental about most things. He was sentimental about handwriting. On a January morning so cold the puddles on the job site had gone to glass, Aubrey hired the first of what would become a youth apprenticeship program through the firm. 2 high school seniors from the East Side, referred through the career fair he had attended in September. He paired them with senior engineers. He told his staff to treat the kids the way they wished someone had treated them when they were 17 and didn't know what they were capable of. His staff did. One of the seniors, a girl named Petra, whose mother had told her engineering was not a realistic goal for someone in their situation, took apart a load calculation spreadsheet in her first week, found an error no one else had noticed, and corrected it without being asked. Aubrey walked by her desk, looked at the screen, looked at her, and said, "That's exactly right. Keep going." She kept going. He met Nadia Ostrowski in February. She was a civil engineer at a competing firm, 39 years old, methodical and precise in the way of people who solve structural problems for a living. And she had a laugh that appeared rarely and without warning, and was therefore, when it appeared, worth whatever it cost to produce it. They met at a joint project debrief for a South End development, disagreed thoroughly about 3 technical specifications, and went for coffee afterward to continue disagreeing in a more comfortable setting. She had heard about the Gala in the way you hear things in the professional community of a mid-sized city, through the particular velocity of a story people feel compelled to pass along. She did not bring it up. It was not her business, and it was not the point. The point was the person across the table from her, who listened more carefully than anyone she had sat across from in recent memory, and disagreed with her not to win, but to get the thing right. She came back to 2 more project debriefs, then to dinner, then to a Saturday morning walk along the Greenway where the conversation ran so long they were surprised by the afternoon. She never asked about the marriage. She understood the difference between a person's history and a person's character. They are related but not identical, and she knew which one she was interested in. What she saw instead was the man who was at the job site before his crew every morning, the man who called the hospital foundation every quarter to ask if the cardiac rehabilitation fund still had what it needed and replenished it without announcement when it did not. The man who, when asked what he was most proud of in his career, was quiet for a moment and then said, "There's a building on Moorhead Street I certified 6 years ago. 8 stories. Every single day, people go into that building and never once think about whether the floor will hold. That's what I want. That's the whole thing." She had looked at him across the dinner table. "You understand that's remarkable," she said. "It's just the work," he said. "That," she said, "is what I mean. Psychology research on what is sometimes called core self-evaluation. A person's fundamental assessment of their own competence and worth consistently finds that individuals with strong, stable core self-evaluations are measurably more resilient, more productive, and more capable of genuine intimacy than those whose self-worth depends on external validation. The difference is not visible in good times. It becomes visible when everything goes wrong. Aubrey had never needed a room to see him. He had needed the work to be real. That need had remained entirely constant across 4 years of being systematically undervalued, 1 gala's worth of public recognition, a divorce, and a winter of building something from scratch again. He was exactly the same person throughout. This is rarer than it sounds. Ruth called him every Sunday. She called him son and meant it more each time. He always answered. He always had time. Claudia was rebuilding in the particular way that requires you to start from a more honest foundation than the one you were on before. Several professional relationships had proven to be positional, attached to her role, not to her. The account she had been counting on to close clean in January had required an additional 3 months of painful renegotiation in Barrett's absence, because significant pieces of it had depended on relationships he had managed, relationships that evaporated along with him. She had spent the fall believing she was standing on solid ground. The ground had been, in significant part, his performance, and his performance had been borrowed money with no intention to repay. She was, slowly, finding her own footing, not the footing she had imagined, the real kind, which is always less comfortable in the short term and more durable in the long term. She had started seeing a therapist in Midtown, which she had declined to do for years on the grounds that she did not have the time, which is one of the more common ways people say they are afraid of what they will find. She was beginning to understand the distance between driving towards something you want and running from something you fear. They feel identical from the inside, particularly when you are moving fast enough. The difference becomes visible only when you stop. She did not call Aubrey. She understood that the door she had closed was not one that could be reopened, and more importantly, that she did not have the right to ask him to hold it open while she figured out who she wanted to be. That understanding, small and late and difficult, was its own kind of growth. A year later, October had come back around to Charlotte the way it does, unhurried, the red maples along Sharon Amity Road, going deep amber at the edges, the kind of afternoon that makes a city look like it is just now becoming what it was always going to be. Aubrey Weston was in the open bay of a construction site in South End, hard hat on, drawings in hand, walking Petra through the load-bearing logic of a transfer beam she had flagged for review. She had questions that were better than most of the questions he received from engineers twice her age. He answered them the same way he answered everything. Straight, complete, without condescension. "You're not just checking the math," he told her. "You're asking what the math is protecting. A building, people inside it, their ordinary Tuesday mornings. That's what the numbers are for." She thought about it, then said, "So the whole point is that nobody ever has to think about it." "The whole point," he said, "is that they don't have to." She nodded, went back to the drawings. He let the moment be what it was, which is the only way to let a moment that matters actually do its work. The apprenticeship program had grown to 11 students by fall. The waiting list for the following cohort was 23 names long. Aubrey taught the Thursday morning session himself and intended to keep doing so. He wanted the students to see the person who ran the firm and signed the checks was the same person who showed up in work clothes and thought hard about hard problems. The distance between where they were and where they were going was real. It was not impossible. It never had been. His father had lived this. Aubrey was passing it on the same way he had received it. Not through speeches, through demonstration, through the patient, repetitive work of being the thing you are trying to show someone. On a Friday evening in October, he picked up Nadia from her office on Trade Street and drove to a restaurant on Montford Avenue, where the booths were worth sitting in and the food was worth talking about, and the conversation reliably ran longer than either of them planned. She told him about a foundation problem she had been working through all week, the particular kind that lives in the soil conditions rather than the structure itself. He listened the way he always listened. Fully, without waiting for his turn to speak, he asked 2 questions that reframed the whole thing in a way she had not considered. She looked at him across the table. "How do you do that?" she said. "Just cut straight to the center of it." He thought about it honestly. "I've been looking at what's underneath things for a long time," he said. "You get used to it." She smiled, the rare kind that arrived without warning and was worth the wait. They drove home through the amber evening, the city lit up along the skyline, the kind of light that makes you think about what endures. He was, he realized, genuinely settled, not triumphant, not relieved, not the version of happy that requires something to compare itself to. The other kind, the one that doesn't need an audience. The story leaves something specific behind, something worth sitting with. There are people in every room who have been doing the essential work without announcement, who have been carrying weight that does not show, who have been making the floor hold while other people walked across it and never thought about what was underneath. Those people do not always get a gala. They do not always get a microphone. The world is not consistently fair in its distribution of recognition, which is one of the things that makes it difficult to endure, and also, when you look at it clearly, one of the things that makes integrity worth something. But here is what is also true. The work does not require the recognition to be real. The floor holds whether anyone thanks it or not. The foundation supports the building whether anyone reads the load calculations or not. A man who has spent his life doing the work that holds things up does not need a room to confirm he was right. He already knows. He knew before the room did, and he will know long after the room has moved on to the next thing. If you are the one who has been quiet, building something real while someone nearby looked past you to the next convenient surface, stay with the work. The quiet work. The work that does not photograph well and does not trend and does not require applause to be true. The foundation you are laying will outlast every opinion anyone held about you. The truth does not need to be announced, it only needs to be built. And then, one ordinary Thursday evening in October, in a room full of people who did not see it coming, it will simply be there, holding everything up, the way it always was.